close your eyes to the chaos of the world. Let the deep rhythm of the ocean waves clear your mind, and feel the warmth of the crackling campfire beside this cozy beach cabin as you open your book. Tonight, the soothing sounds of nature will guide you into a state of deep relaxation and sleep. As we step into the misty, isolated landscapes of 19th England to journey through Charlotte Bronte's masterpiece, a story of dark secrets, cold mansions, and an unbroken spirit. Jane Eyre. Let the crackle of the wood and the distant tide carry you away as we begin. Chapter 1. Chapter 1. Gateshead Hall. The cold winter wind howled relentlessly against the heavy, multi-paned glass windows of Gateshead Hall. It drove a bitter, freezing rain across the bleak, saturated grounds of the estate. Inside, 10-year-old Jane Eyre found herself completely isolated. She was physically and emotionally cut off from the only family she had ever known. Her aunt, Mrs. Reed, sat comfortably by the drawing room fireside. She was surrounded by her own pampered, smiling children, John, Eliza, and Georgiana. Jane had been pointedly and cruelly excluded from their tight domestic circle. She had been severely scolded by her aunt for lacking a more sociable, childlike, and attractive disposition, seeking an immediate refuge from their coldness, hostility, and constant verbal abuse. Jane slipped quietly into a small, vacant breakfast room. She climbed up onto the window seat. She drew the thick scarlet drapery completely close. This effectively sealed herself away from the hostile world of Gateshead Hall. In this cramped, hidden sanctuary, she eagerly opened Thomas Bewick's History of British Birds. The bleak descriptions of Arctic regions, the solitary rocks, and the melancholic, storm-beaten islands resonated deeply with her. It matched her own profound, aching sense of loneliness, abandonment, and despair. Her fragile, quiet peace was abruptly and violently shattered by the sudden arrival of John Reed. At 14 years old, John was a bloated, tyrannical, and vicious bully. He tormented Jane systematically on a daily basis. He was driven by a cruel, arrogant awareness of her dependent, penniless status within the household. He actively sought her out today. He demanded she stand directly before him to receive her customary punishment and abuse. He insulted her physical appearance. He called her a miserable, ungrateful dependent. He loudly declared that she had absolutely no right to live among respectable, wealthy people. He said she had no right to touch their expensive books. With sudden, vicious, and terrifying force, John hurled the heavy, bound volume directly at her head. The book struck Jane sharply behind the ear. It cut her young scalp and caused hot blood to trickle down her neck. The sharp physical pain, combined with years of accumulated humiliation, burning resentment, and suppressed outrage, instantly ignited a rare, blinding spark of fierce rebellion within the young orphan. Shaking violently with pure fury, Jane flew at him. She fiercely defended herself with her bare hands. She branded him a wicked, cruel murderer. She told him he behaved exactly like a Roman emperor. The violent, noisy commotion immediately brought the frightened servants, Bessie and Miss Abbott, rushing into the room. They were followed closely by the severe, furious, and cold Mrs. Reed. Jane was instantly and universally blamed for the entire altercation. The adults completely disregarded John's blatant physical instigation. Mrs. Reed coldly ordered that Jane be dragged away. Immediately, she ordered her to be locked securely in the Red Room. This was a cold, desolate, and terrifying apartment where Mr. Reed, Jane's late uncle, had died exactly 9 years prior. The ominous room was seldom inhabited by anyone. It was characterized by its imposing, dark mahogany furniture, its heavy, muffled crimson curtains, and an eerie, pervasive, and suffocating stillness, left entirely alone in the gathering gloom of the afternoon. Jane caught a sudden reflection of her own pale, tear-stained face in the large, dark wardrobe mirror. She appeared to herself like a restless, tiny spirit. As the evening deepened, the absolute darkness grew. The terrifying weight of her isolation began to completely paralyze her young, imaginative mind with superstitious dread. She desperately remembered her uncle's past kindness. She wondered if his ghost might actually return to the earth to avenge her current mistreatment. Yet, the terrifying thought of a supernatural visitation filled her with an absolute, breathless panic. As the slow hours crept by, the psychological torture reached its ultimate horrific peak. Jane suddenly noticed a strange, moving shaft of pale light sliding slowly across the high ceiling, convinced it was a supernatural herald from the spirit world. Her breath caught in her throat, a wild, suffocating, and overwhelming terror took total possession of her small body. She rushed frantically to the heavy locked door. She frantically shook the brass handle. She screamed out wildly to her aunt for mercy. She begged to be released from the room. She begged to be punished in any other physical way. Chapter 2. Lowwood School. The painful memory of the Red Room slowly faded into a cold, grim reality. Several months had passed since that terrifying night. Jane was finally being sent away from Gateshead Hall. Mrs. Reed had arranged for her to attend Lowwood Institution. This was a charity school for orphaned girls. The journey began before dawn on a bleak, freezing morning. Jane sat alone in the chilly coach. She watched the familiar, hostile walls of her aunt's estate vanish into the heavy mist. She felt a mixture of intense relief and deep apprehension. She was leaving her tormentors behind. However, she was stepping into an entirely unknown, uncertain future. The coach traveled for many long, grueling hours through the bleak English countryside. Rain sputtered continuously against the windows. By the time the carriage finally pulled up to the gates of Lowwood, darkness had completely fallen. The school appeared as a large, somber stone building. It was surrounded by high, suffocating walls. Jane was led inside by a stern servant. She was immediately introduced to the superintendent, Miss Temple. Unlike the other adults Jane had known, Miss Temple possessed a pale, beautiful face. She had a refined, remarkably kind demeanor. She spoke to the exhausted, shivering child with genuine gentleness. She ordered some simple food for her before sending her to the dormitory. Jane slept that night in a vast, cold room filled with dozens of other silent, hushed orphan girls. The next morning brought the harsh, disciplined routine of Lowwood into sharp focus. The rising bell rang relentlessly at dawn. The girls were forced to dress quickly in the freezing room. The water in the pitchers was frozen solid into sheets of ice. This made it completely impossible for them to wash. Jane followed the long lines of quietly uniformed girls down to the dark refectory for breakfast. The meal was a complete disaster. The porridge was burnt, emitting a sickening, unappetizing odor. It was entirely inedible. The hungry children whispered in quiet, miserable complaint. Miss Temple observed the situation with deep, visible displeasure. Demonstrating her inherent generosity, she ordered that a special lunch of bread and cheese be served to the girls at her own personal expense. This act of kindness earned her the deep, silent adoration of Jane and the other orphans. Later that day, Jane was allowed into the cold garden during a brief recess. She stood alone, shivering in the biting wind. She observed a girl sitting quietly on a stone bench, deeply engrossed in a book. Jane approached her carefully. The girl introduced herself as Helen Burns. Helen was older, possessed a calm, deeply intellectual countenance, and bore the school's harsh discipline with incredible patience. While they spoke, a severe teacher, Miss Scott, repeatedly reprimanded Helen for minor, trivial errors. She even struck Helen across the neck with a bundle of twigs. She expected Helen to weep or rebel. Instead, Helen remained perfectly composed. She accepted the cruel punishment without a single tear or angry word. Later, Jane questioned Helen about her unbelievable submission. Helen explained her profound, deeply Christian philosophy of endurance. She told Jane that it was far better to forgive enemies than to harbor bitter resentment. She stated that the spirit must rise above earthly suffering. Jane listened with deep fascination, yet her own fierce, passionate nature could not fully comprehend such total self-sacrifice. She knew she could never remain silent under such unfair treatment. Yet, Helen's peaceful strength deeply comforted Jane's troubled soul. A deep, unbreakable bond of friendship was instantly forged between the two lonely girls. The fragile peace of the school was shattered a few weeks later by the arrival of Mr. Brocklehurst, he was the cold, tyrannical treasurer of Lowwood. He was a tall, black-cloaked man who viewed the orphans as miserable sinners. He believed they needed to be humbled through extreme deprivation. He walked through the classrooms, inspecting the girls with a severe, critical eye. He loudly reprimanded Miss Temple for giving them extra food. He declared that it fed their carnal desires. He noticed a girl with naturally curly hair and ordered it to be cut off completely. He stated that vanity-inducing curls had no place in a Christian institution. Jane trembled as he approached her section. She tried desperately to hide behind her slate, but her hands shook with nervousness. The slate slipped from her fingers. It shattered loudly upon the stone floor. The sharp noise echoed through the silent room. Mr. Brocklehurst stopped instantly. He glared at Jane with absolute fury. He ordered her to stand upon a high stool in the very center of the room. He commanded the entire school to look at her. He loudly branded her a liar. He warned the students and teachers to avoid her company at all costs. Jane stood frozen on the stool, engulfed in absolute humiliation, feeling completely destroyed as the tears finally spilled down her burning cheeks. Chapter 3. The Ascent at Lowwood. The agonizing minutes spent standing upon that high stool felt like an eternity. Mr. Brocklehurst's cruel words echoed loudly through the cold, silent room. Jane felt completely crushed under the weight of universal scorn. She believed her reputation was permanently ruined. When the school was finally dismissed, she collapsed into a dark corner of the empty classroom. She wept bitter, uncontrollable tears of absolute despair. However, her deep misery was quickly interrupted by the arrival of Helen. Burns Helen did not avoid Jane as ordered. Instead, she brought her a warm smile and a quiet, profound comfort. Helen gently assured Jane that the girls did not hate her. She explained that they actually pitied her, because they knew the harsh character of Mr. Brocklehurst. Soon after, Miss Temple invited both Jane and Helen to her private room. The apartment was warm, tidy, and filled with a rare aura of peace. Miss Temple sat the two girls down by her bright fire. She looked into Jane's tearful eyes with genuine compassion. She asked Jane to tell her true story from the very beginning. She promised to judge her only by her own words, not by Mr. Brocklehurst's cruel accusations. Jane gathered her courage. She poured out her heart, detailing her miserable childhood at Gateshead Hall, the terrible tyranny of John Reed, and the psychological horror of the Red Room. Miss Temple listened with deep, unwavering attention. She occasionally adjusted her glasses or frowned, with quiet indignation at the injustice Jane had suffered. After Jane finished her long narrative, Miss Temple smiled kindly. She told Jane that she believed her completely. She promised to write to Mr. Lloyd, the apothecary who had treated Jane after her collapse, to officially confirm her story. Once that confirmation arrived, Jane would be publicly cleared of all charges before the entire school. To celebrate this moment of hope, Miss Temple unlocked a small drawer. She produced a precious seed cake, cutting generous slices for the two hungry girls. For a few beautiful hours, the cold reality of Lowwood vanished completely. Jane listened in absolute awe as Helen and Miss Temple conversed about classical literature, poetry, and French history. She felt a burning desire to learn, to grow, and to prove herself worthy of such incredible friends. A few weeks later, Mr. Lloyd's letter arrived. It fully verified every single detail of Jane's account. Miss Temple wasted no time. She assembled the entire school in the grand hall. She read the letter aloud in a clear, commanding voice. She officially declared Jane Eyre completely innocent of the charge of falsehood. The heavy weight was instantly lifted from Jane's young soul. From that day forward, she applied herself to her studies with a fierce, untamed determination. She mastered French, developed a remarkable talent for drawing, and quickly rose to the top of her class. The harsh routine of the school became bearable because she now possessed a clear purpose, a respected position, and the deep love of Helen and Miss Temple. However, this period of happiness was tragically short. As spring arrived, the damp, unhealthy location of Lowwood transformed the school into a breeding ground for disease. A severe typhus epidemic swept through the crowded dormitories. The halls were suddenly filled with the sickening smell of medicine, the groans of dying children, and a pervasive terror. More than half of the girls fell dangerously ill. The school's rigid discipline completely dissolved into chaos. Jane remained healthy, spending her days wandering the blooming garden, deeply saddened by the surrounding tragedy. Yet, a far worse blow was about to strike her. Helen Burns did not contract typhus, but her chronic consumption grew rapidly worse. She was moved to Miss Temple's private room to spend her final days. One night, driven by a deep, frantic instinct, Jane snuck out of her bed. She crept silently through the dark, quiet corridors to Miss Temple's room. She slipped inside, finding Helen lying pale and incredibly frail beneath the blankets. Helen was not afraid of her approaching death. She smiled weakly at Jane, whispering words of profound faith and comfort. She told Jane that she was going home to her universal father. She said she was escaping a world of endless suffering. The two girls clung to each other tightly. Jane fell asleep with her arms wrapped protectively around her friend's neck. The next morning, Jane woke up to find the servants weeping. Helen had died peacefully in her sleep, her head still resting gently against Jane's chest. Chapter 4. The Transition to Thornfield. 8 long years passed within the grim stone walls of Lowwood Institution. The terrible typhus epidemic had eventually forced the public to investigate the school's deplorable conditions, leading to the removal of the tyrannical Mr. Brocklehurst under new, humane management. The school transformed into a truly respectable and nurturing educational center. Jane had spent 6 of those years as a diligent student and the final 2 as a dedicated teacher. However, her quiet world was suddenly disrupted when Miss Temple, her beloved mentor and maternal figure, married a clergyman and left the school. Miss Temple's departure instantly dissolved the invisible bond that held Jane to Lowwood, reawakening her fierce, untamed desire for liberty and a wider experience in the world. Desperate for a change, Jane placed an advertisement in a local newspaper seeking a position as a private governess. Within a week, she received a single, promising reply from a lady named Mrs. Fairfax, offering her employment at a grand country estate called Thornfield Hall. Jane eagerly accepted the offer, said farewell to the place that had shaped her youth, and embarked on a long journey into the unknown. When she finally arrived at Thornfield late at night, she was pleasantly surprised by her reception. Instead of the cold, severe authority she had come to expect from wealthy employers, Mrs. Fairfax welcomed her with genuine warmth, kindness, and hospitality. Jane soon discovered that Mrs. Fairfax was not the owner of the estate, but merely the widowed housekeeper managing the property. The next morning, Jane explored Thornfield Hall and found it to be a grand, ancient, and stately manor filled with dark mahogany furniture, historical portraits, and a deep, pervasive stillness. She was formally introduced to her young pupil, Adele Varens, a lively, French-speaking 7-year-old girl. Mrs. Fairfax explained that Adele was the ward of the estate's absent master, Mr. Edward Rochester. Jane found Adele to be charming, though somewhat spoiled and easily distracted, and she immediately commenced her duties with a renewed sense of purpose. The autumn days passed in a peaceful, predictable routine. Yet Jane often climbed to the roof of the mansion, looking out at the distant horizon and longing for a life of passion, action, and vivid human connection that lay far beyond her quiet existence. During her explorations of the 3rd floor of the mansion, a dark, dusty corridor lined with locked doors and ancient relics, Jane's peaceful thoughts were shattered by a disturbing sound. She heard a distinct, low, and utterly mirthless laugh echoing from behind one of the heavy doors. It was a tragic, preternatural sound that chilled Jane to the bone. When she questioned Mrs. Fairfax about the unsettling noise, the housekeeper dismissed her fears with casual nonchalance, attributing the laughter to Grace Poole, a solitary, eccentric seamstress who was hired to work on the 3rd floor. Despite Mrs. Fairfax's reassurances, Jane remained deeply unsettled by the mysterious, haunting atmosphere of the 3rd floor. Winter arrived, coating the grounds of Thornfield in a stark, frozen beauty. One chilly afternoon, Jane volunteered to walk to the nearby village of Hay to post a letter for Mrs. Fairfax. As She walked down the narrow, icy lane. The quiet twilight was interrupted by the heavy, rhythmic thud of an approaching horse. Suddenly, the horse slipped violently on a sheet of hidden ice, causing both the animal and its rider to crash heavily to the ground. Jane rushed forward without hesitation to offer assistance. The rider was a man wrapped in a dark cloak, possessing a grim, fierce, and stern countenance with heavy brows and a dark, brooding look. He rudely rejected her offer of help at first, but his injured ankle made it impossible for him to mount his horse without assistance. Jane firmly refused to leave him alone in the freezing dusk, forcing him to lean heavily upon her shoulder to steady himself. Once he successfully he rode away into the darkness without uttering a single word of gratitude, leaving Jane fascinated and strangely energized by the rough, unconventional encounter. When she finally returned to Thornfield Hall, she found the mansion in a state of bustling. A CTIVITY, Mrs. Fairfax informed her that the master had just arrived, and Jane realized that the stern, injured rider she had encountered on the road was none other than Mr. Edward Rochester himself. Chapter 5. The Master of Thornfield. Mr. Rochester's presence completely transformed the quiet atmosphere of Thornfield Hall. The once silent mansion was now filled with sudden commands, the constant movement of servants, and a strange, dynamic energy. For several days, Jane saw very little of the master. He was deeply occupied with estate business, and his injured ankle kept him confined to his private study. However, one evening, Mrs. Fairfax informed Jane that Mr. Rochester had requested their presence in the grand drawing room for tea. He wished to formally inspect his young ward's new governess and evaluate her progress. When Jane entered the room, she found Mr. Rochester sitting in a large armchair, surrounded by his great black dog, Pilot. The firelight illuminated his stern, heavy-browed face, which looked even grimmer than it had on the icy lane. He paid very little attention to Jane at first, focusing his conversation on Adele and Mrs. Fairfax. When he finally addressed Jane, his tone was abrupt, sharp, and unconventional. He did not engage in polite drawing-room small talk. Instead, he questioned her directly about her life at Lowwood, her talents, and her inner thoughts. He demanded to see her portfolio of drawings. He examined her artwork with intense, searching eyes, noticing the unique, melancholic, and deeply imaginative nature of her sketches. He bluntly told her that her work showed a mind that was far from ordinary, yet he offered no polite compliments before dismissing them for the night. As the winter weeks passed, these evening conversations became a regular occurrence. Mr. Rochester frequently sent for Jane to sit with him by the fire. He found her quiet, completely honest, and fiercely independent nature to be a remarkable contrast to the superficial people he usually encountered in high society. He began to pour out his mind to her, speaking of his bitter past, his painful mistakes, and the heavy, invisible burden of his life. Jane listened to him without fear, responding to his cynical remarks with a sharp, calm wit that amused and intrigued him. She realized that despite his rough exterior, his moods, and his arrogant demands, he possessed a deeply wounded, generous soul. An unspoken, powerful intellectual connection began to form between the master and the penniless governess. One night, this growing bond was tested by a terrifying event. Jane was awakened from a deep sleep by a strange, sickening sound outside her chamber door. It was a low, cruel, and demonic laugh, followed by the sound of footsteps retreating toward the third-floor corridor. Filled with a sudden, anxious dread, Jane wrapped herself in a shawl and stepped out into the dark hallway. She immediately noticed a thick, suffocating cloud of smoke pouring out from Mr. Rochester's bedchamber. Jane rushed into his room without a moment's hesitation. The scene was horrific. The heavy velvet curtains of his bed were completely engulfed in roaring flames, and the smoke was rapidly filling the space. Mr. Rochester was lying in the center of the bed, completely unconscious, drugged by the heavy smoke. Jane shouted his name frantically, but he did not stir. Acting with desperate, rapid instinct, she seized the large water pitchers from the washstand and hurled the water directly onto the blazing bed and onto the sleeping master. She worked frantically in the darkness until the fire was completely extinguished, leaving the room damp, smoky, and pitch black. The sudden deluge of cold water instantly shocked Mr. Rochester awake. He shouted in confusion and anger, but Jane quickly explained the situation, telling him about the demonic laugh she had heard and the fire that had almost consumed him. His reaction was strange and deeply unsettling. Instead of immediately raising an alarm to wake the servants, he became intensely quiet and grave. He commanded Jane to remain in his room, while he took a candle and went up to the mysterious third floor. He returned many minutes later, pale, shaken, and deeply troubled. He looked at Jane with an expression of intense emotion. He took both her hands in his, thanking her with a voice that trembled with genuine, deep-seated passion. He told her that she had saved his life, and that he owed her a debt he could never fully repay. He begged her to stay with him just a moment longer, but Jane, overwhelmed by the intense intimacy of the moment and the cold, damp air, gently excused herself and returned to her own room. She lay awake for the rest of the night, her mind racing with a mixture of terror, confusion, and a powerful, undeniable awakening of love for her master. Chapter 6. The Arrival of Blanche Ingram. The morning after the terrifying fire, Jane expected a full investigation into the mysterious events of the third floor. However, she was deeply shocked to find that the entire incident was completely covered up. Mrs. Fairfax casually explained that Grace Poole had accidentally set the fire with a candle while asleep. Jane watched Grace Poole carefully later that day. The eccentric seamstress remained perfectly calm, blunt, and entirely showing no signs of guilt or fear. Jane realized with a sinking heart that Mr. Rochester was hiding a dark, dangerous secret that bound him to that strange woman. Her confusion deepened when she discovered that Mr. Rochester had abruptly left Thornfield Hall that morning to attend a grand house party in a nearby county. A few weeks later, a letter arrived from the master, announcing his imminent return with a large group of wealthy, aristocratic guests. The quiet mansion was instantly thrown into a frenzy of intense preparation. When the party finally arrived, the house was filled with music, laughter, and high society glamour. Among the guests was Miss Blanche Ingram, a remarkably beautiful, tall, and elegant woman with dark, flashing eyes and a commanding presence. Mrs. Fairfax had previously warned Jane that Blanche was considered by everyone to be Mr. Rochester's destined bride. Jane was forced to sit quietly in the corner of the drawing room each evening with young Adele, watching the cruel spectacle of high society courtship. Jane watched Mr. Rochester closely during these long evenings. She observed how Blanche played the piano, sang beautifully, and constantly flattered the master with arrogant charm. Yet, Jane also noticed that Blanche's mind was superficial, cold, and entirely devoid of genuine kindness. Despite this, Mr. Rochester seemed to pay court to her, participating in their lavish games and theatrical charades. Sitting in her dark corner, Jane felt a sharp, agonizing pain in her heart. She was forced to admit to herself the absolute truth. She was deeply, desperately in love with her master. She knew she was poor, plain, and a mere governess, yet she felt intellectually and spiritually superior to the wealthy Blanche. The atmosphere at Thornfield grew even stranger when an unexpected guest arrived during Mr. Roch's brief absence one afternoon. The man introduced himself as Mr. Richard Mason, a handsome but remarkably weak-looking gentleman from the West Indies. Jane noticed that when Mr. Rochester returned and learned of Mason's arrival, a look of absolute, pure terror and grim despair washed over his face. That very same evening, an old, wrinkled gypsy woman arrived at the mansion, offering to tell the fortunes of the young ladies. Blanche Ingram went into the private library first, but returned, looking deeply disappointed and thoroughly displeased by her reading. Curiosity filled the house, and the gypsy woman suddenly demanded to see the young governess. Jane entered the dimly lit library with a calm, cautious mind. The old woman sat by the fire, her face hidden beneath a heavy bonnet. She began to question Jane intensely about her feelings, her life at Lowwood, and her relationship with the master of the house. As the conversation progressed, Jane noticed that the gypsy's voice grew remarkably familiar, sharp and deeply resonant. Suddenly, the old woman threw back her heavy bonnet and laughed. Jane gasped in absolute shock. It was Mr. Rochester himself in a clever disguise. He had used the masquerade to test the true intentions of Blanche, Ingram, and to pry into Jane's guarded heart. When Jane informed him that Richard Mason had arrived at the house, Mr. Rochester staggered as if he had been struck a physical blow. He leaned heavily upon Jane's shoulder, his face pale and full of dread, whispering that he lived on the very edge of a volcanic eruption. Chapter 7. The Midnight Cry and Gateshead's Call. The tense peace of the mansion was shattered in the middle of the night by a sharp, piercing scream that echoed from the third floor. It was a sound of absolute curdling terror that woke every guest in the house. Panic immediately erupted in the corridors as dressed figures emerged from their rooms in confusion. Mr. Rochester quickly descended from the upper floor, calmly reassuring his guests that a servant had merely suffered a nightmare. His smooth words eventually persuaded everyone to return to bed, but Jane remained deeply skeptical. She dressed quickly and waited in her room, sensing that her master would soon have need of her. Her intuition proved entirely correct when Mr. Rochester knocked softly on her door. He spoke in a tense whisper, requesting her urgent, secretive assistance. He led her silently up to the forbidden third floor, through a concealed door behind a tapestry, and into a hidden room. There, Jane was horrified to find Mr. Richard Mason sitting in a chair, his clothing completely saturated with blood from deep, vicious wounds on his shoulder and arm. Mr. Rochester commanded Jane to hold a sponge to the bleeding wounds and to bind them tightly, strictly forbidding her from speaking a single word to Mason while he left the room to fetch a surgeon. For several agonizing hours, Jane sat in the dimly lit, terrifying room with the pale, fainting man. From behind a locked inner door, she could distinctly hear the sound of a wild animal pacing, accompanied by low, snarling growls and a dog-like snapping. It was a deeply surreal and horrific experience. Yet Jane performed her duties with a calm, unwavering focus. Mr. Rochester returned before dawn with a surgeon, who quickly dressed Mason's wounds. Before the servants could wake, Mason was quietly smuggled out of the mansion and into a carriage, to be taken away in absolute secrecy. Shortly after this exhausting ordeal, Jane received an unexpected visitor from her past. Robert Levin, the coachman from Gateshead Hall, arrived with grave news. Her tyrannical cousin, John Reed, had ruined his health and fortune through a life of extreme dissipation, and had ultimately committed suicide in London. Upon hearing the news of her son's death, Mrs. Reed had suffered a severe, paralyzing stroke. Robert explained that the dying woman was repeatedly calling for Jane, refusing to pass away until she saw her niece one final time. Despite the years of cruel abuse she had suffered at Gateshead, Jane's compassionate nature compelled her to go. Before her departure, Jane had a private, deeply emotional meeting with Mr. Rochester in the garden. She requested a brief leave of absence, which he reluctantly granted after making her promise to return to Thornfield soon. He questioned her about her future, hinting heavily that his marriage to Blanche Ingram was fast approaching and that he would soon need to find a new situation for his young governess. The thought of leaving him caused Jane a sharp, suffocating pain, yet she maintained her composed demeanor, bade him a quiet farewell, and embarked on the long journey back to the home of her childhood. Jane arrived at Gateshead Hall to find the estate in a state of gloomy, miserable decay. Her cousins, Eliza and Georgiana, had grown into cold, selfish, and deeply resentful women who treated each other with mutual contempt. Jane was led into the dark, stifling bedroom where Mrs. Reed lay completely paralyzed. The old woman's mind was broken, yet she recognized Jane after several days. With a cold, unrepentant hand, she gave Jane a letter that had arrived 3 years prior from Jane Eyre, Jane's wealthy uncle in Madeira, who wished to adopt her and leave her his entire fortune. Mrs. Reed confessed that she had hidden the letter out of pure, lingering malice, wishing to keep Jane in poverty. Jane freely forgave her dying aunt, but Mrs. Reed died that very night, completely cold and incapable of accepting love. Chapter 8. The Proposal Under the Orchard Tree. Jane returned to Thornfield Hall after a month's absence, finding the grand estate bathed in the warm, golden light of midsummer. Her heart swelled with an undeniable, aching joy upon seeing the familiar gray walls and the grand old trees. To her immense relief, there was still no official announcement regarding Mr. Rochester's impending marriage to Blanche Ingram. The aristocratic guests had completely departed, and the mansion had returned to its quiet, predictable routine. For a few beautiful, blissful weeks, Jane enjoyed a profound, uninterrupted peace, spending her long summer evenings walking through the blooming grounds with her master. One sultry, magnificent evening, Jane met Mr. Rochester in the orchard. The air was heavy with the sweet, intoxicating scent of ripening fruit and blooming roses. The moon rose large and pale over the distant hills, casting long, dramatic shadows across the grass. Mr. Rochester walked beside her, his face unusually grave, deep in contemplation. He began to speak of his approaching wedding in a low, somber tone. He told Jane that he had finally found a suitable situation for her as a governess in Ireland, far across the sea. He explained that she would have to leave Thornfield immediately upon his marriage to Miss Ingram, as her presence would no longer be appropriate. The devastating news broke through Jane's carefully constructed defenses, shattering her customary reserve. The thought of being permanently separated from him, of crossing the wide sea to a cold, foreign land, caused a sharp, suffocating pain to erupt within her chest. Tears of absolute, pure agony spilled down her cheeks. In a sudden, magnificent burst of passion, she fiercely declared that she could not bear to leave Thornfield. She told him that she loved the estate because she had found a true, intellectual, and spiritual equal in him. She passionately proclaimed that she was not a cold, unfeeling machine, and that her spirit was entirely equal to his, regardless of her poverty or her plain appearance. Mr. Rochester listened to her frantic, desperate confession with a strange, fierce joy illuminating his dark face. He did not interrupt her wild outburst. Instead, he gathered her tightly into his strong arms, pulling her close against his chest. He looked deep into her tear-stained eyes and passionately declared that Blanche Ingram was absolutely nothing to him. He explained that he had only staged the elaborate courtship to ignite Jane's guarded jealousy and to force her to reveal her true feelings. With a voice trembling with deep emotion, he begged her to be his wife, to share his fortune, and to bind her destiny to his forever. Jane stood entirely frozen in his embrace, her mind reeling in absolute, breathless confusion. She looked at his fierce, earnest face, searching for any signs of mockery or deceit, seeing only pure, unadulterated devotion. A wave of intense, overwhelming happiness washed over her soul. She gladly accepted his proposal, whispering her assent beneath the ancient, twisted branches of the giant chestnut tree. As they sealed their vows with a passionate embrace, the bright summer sky suddenly darkened with ominous racing clouds. A violent, terrifying thunderstorm erupted directly overhead, forcing the newly betrothed lovers to rush back to the safety of the mansion. The next morning brought a stark, chilling omen that cast a dark shadow over Jane's joy. Adele ran into her room, breathlessly informing her that the giant chestnut tree in the orchard, the very tree beneath which Mr. Rochester had proposed, had been struck by a fierce bolt of lightning during the night. The massive, ancient trunk had been violently split completely in two, leaving one half blackened and ruined upon the ground. Despite this unsettling sign, the weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a whirlwind of frantic, luxurious preparation. Mr. Rochester insisted on buying Jane expensive silks, fine laces, and priceless jewels. Attempting to transform his plain governess into a wealthy lady, Jane fiercely resisted his lavish gifts. Clinging to her independent identity and longing for the simple, quiet life they had shared before. Chapter 9. The Ruined Wedding. The month of frantic preparation flew by, and the night before the wedding arrived, Jane was plagued by a deep, suffocating sense of anxiety. While Mr. Rochester was away on business, a terrifying incident occurred in her room. In the dead of night, Jane woke to see a strange, macabre woman standing before her wardrobe. The stranger was tall and large, with thick, dark hair hanging down her back, and a pale, bloated face that looked like a vampire. The spectral figure picked up Jane's expensive wedding veil, tore it violently, completely in two, and trampled it upon the floor. When Mr. Rochester returned, he desperately tried to soothe Jane's terror, claiming it was merely a cruel hallucination, or perhaps Grace Poole in a fit of madness. He begged her to trust him for just one more day. The morning of the wedding was cold, gray, and misty. Jane and Mr. Rochester walked silently to the small, isolated church near the estate. The sanctuary was entirely empty, except for the clergyman and two cloaked strangers sitting quietly in the shadows. As the priest began the holy ceremony and reached the sacred words asking if anyone knew of any impediment to the marriage, one of the strangers stood up. In a loud, clear, and commanding voice, the man declared that the ceremony could not proceed. He announced that Mr. Edward Rochester was already legally married to another living woman. The stunning accusation struck the church like a bolt of lightning. Mr. Rochester tightened his grip on Jane's arm, his face turning into a mask of pure, defiant fury. The stranger introduced himself as Mr. Briggs, a solicitor from London, and produced an official marriage certificate. He revealed that 15 years prior, in Jamaica, Mr. Rochester had wed Bertha Mason, the sister of Richard Mason. Richard Mason himself then stepped forward from the shadows, still pale from his recent wounds, to confirm the terrible truth. Realizing that his deception was completely shattered, Mr. Rochester's defiance collapsed into grim resignation. He admitted everything, but fiercely demanded that the men follow him to Thornfield Hall to see exactly what kind of wife he had been forced to wed. He led Jane, Briggs, and Mason up to the 3rd floor, through the secret door behind the tapestry, and into the locked room. There, the horrific truth was finally laid bare. Bertha Mason was a wild, mad woman who paced back and forth on all fours like a fierce animal, growling, snarling, and snapping at the walls. Grace Poole was merely her keeper, hired to guard her in absolute secrecy. As they watched, the mad woman flew at Mr. Rochester, trying to bite his neck, and he was forced to bind her tightly to a chair. Mr. Rochester turned to Jane, his voice breaking with deep emotion, and asked everyone to compare this demonic, broken creature with the pure, innocent girl he had tried to marry. Briggs and Mason left the mansion, warning Jane that she must leave this illegal union immediately. Left entirely alone in her room, Jane collapsed under the crushing weight of absolute despair. Her beautiful dreams were completely ruined, and her grand future had vanished into thin air. She spent the entire night in intense prayer, wrestling with her deep love for her master and her unwavering commitment to her moral principles. Before dawn, Jane made a frantic, desperate decision. She packed a tiny bundle of clothes, took her meager savings, and snuck out of the mansion in absolute silence. She could not bear to face Mr. Rochester's desperate pleas to stay as his mistress, knowing it would destroy her own soul. As she walked down the dark road away from Thornfield Hall, tears of pure agony blinded her eyes. She felt completely broken, penniless, and alone in the world, stepping once more into a bleak and entirely unknown future. Chapter 10, Marsh End and the Return to The exhausting journey away from Thornfield Hall brought Jane to the absolute brink of starvation and death, having spent her last coins on a carriage ride that dropped her in an unfamiliar heath. She wandered for days under the cold, relentless rain. She was reduced to begging for scraps of bread from suspicious villagers, just as her strength failed entirely and she collapsed onto the wet earth. A bright light guided her to the doorstep of Moor House. She was rescued by St. John Rivers, a stern and deeply devout clergyman, and his two gentle intellectual sisters, Diana and Mary. They nursed Jane back to health, treating her with genuine warmth and respect without demanding to know her true identity. Jane assumed the false name Jane Elliot to hide from Mr. Rochester. As the weeks passed, Jane formed a deep, affectionate bond with Diana and Mary, finding them to be her true intellectual equals. St. John recognizing Jane's competence and education, offered her a position as the mistress of a newly established charity school for girls in the poor parish of Morton. Jane gladly accepted the humble role, seeking solace in hard work and independence. Soon after, a dramatic twist of fortune shattered her quiet life. St. John discovered her true identity through a signature on a drawing. He revealed to Jane that her uncle, Jane Eyre of Madeira, had passed away, leaving his entire immense fortune of £20,000 to her. Furthermore, Jane discovered that St. John, Diana, and Mary were actually her biological cousins. Overjoyed to finally possess a true family, Jane immediately insisted on dividing the grand inheritance equally among the four of them. The new dynamic took a tense, suffocating turn when St. John, preparing to leave for a lifelong missionary service in India, demanded that Jane accompany him as his wife. He did not love her. Instead, he viewed her as a highly capable tool for his religious duties, claiming that God had formed her for a missionary life. Jane fiercely resisted his proposal, offering to go with him as a sister, but firmly refusing to bind her soul in a loveless, cold marriage. St. John used his immense spiritual authority to pressure her, and Jane's defenses began to crumble under his relentless, icy will. Just as she was on the very verge of submitting to his demands one night, a profound, supernatural event occurred. In the deep silence of the night, she distinctly heard a familiar, deeply emotional voice echoing through the wind, crying out her name, Jane, Jane. It was the unmistakable, agonizing voice of Mr. Rochester. Driven by a frantic, undeniable instinct, Jane rejected St. John completely and embarked on a long journey back to Thornfield Hall. When she finally arrived, she was struck with absolute horror. The once grand mansion was a blackened, ruined skeleton of stone. A local innkeeper informed her that Bertha Mason had set the house on fire months ago. Mr. Rochester had frantically tried to save his mad wife and the servants, but Bertha leaped to her death from the burning roof. During the collapse of the building, Mr. Rochester was severely injured, losing his right hand and being left completely blind. He was now living in absolute isolation at a damp, desolate manor house, deep within a dark forest. Jane rushed to Ferndean without a moment's hesitation. She quietly slipped into the gloomy parlor, finding her master sitting alone in an armchair, appearing like a caged, broken eagle. His dark hair was wild, his face was deeply scarred, and he groped helplessly in the darkness. Jane approached him softly, taking his hand and pouring water into his glass. When he recognized her touch and her voice, a wave of intense disbelief and overwhelming joy washed over his broken spirit. He gathered her tightly into his arms, weeping as he confessed his deep fears, that she had forgotten him or that he was too ruined to be loved. Jane fiercely reassured him of her absolute, unwavering devotion. She told him that she was now a wealthy, independent woman, and that she desired nothing more than to be his hands, his eyes, and his devoted companion forever. Their deep, intellectual and spiritual connection was instantly rekindled, stronger than it had ever been before. They were married in a quiet, simple ceremony surrounded only by the local clergymen and servants. Over the next few years, Mr. Rochester's sight partially returned in one eye, allowing him to see the face of his firstborn son placed into his arms, sealing a life of true, hard-won happiness and absolute love. As our journey through the timeless story of Jane Eyre comes to a gentle close, let your mind rest deeply in this peaceful sanctuary. The fire is now burning low, casting a soft, comforting warmth, while the endless rhythm of the ocean waves continues to wash away the worries of the world. Stay here as long as you need. Wrap yourself in the soothing sounds of the crackling wood and the distant tide, and let them carry you into a deep, restorative sleep. Thank you for listening, and sweet dreams.